Hello, everyone. It's Mrs. Wallace. I just want to do this quick slideshow just to give you a little sense of some of the Enlightenment thinkers that will be on the DBQ. Keep in mind a few things. You know, the Enlightenment is this period in European history, but it has an impact on several areas, especially around the Atlantic. So the Americas, for example, France, for example. So we're looking at the Enlightenment as a follow of the scientific revolution. So something that comes as a result of the ideas and the challenges in the scientific revolution and the focus on reason, some of the things that we talked about in class previously, like rationalism or empiricism. This is more a focus on applying the concept of reason to everyday affairs. So people's quality of life or best government and things like that. Some of the Enlightenment does feel a little bit like pushback against, especially some of the absolutism that existed in France. So this idea about the power of a monarch and what kinds of checks there might be that would be best on a monarch and what other types of government might be best. There's a lot of critique of faith-based knowledge as like exclusive forms of authority. So some of the things that we know that some of the thinkers are going to be focused on, and sometimes the Enlightenment ideas get crowded together into this phrase known as liberalism. And think of liberalism as kind of focused on individual choice and on individual ideas. Deism is something that came up in the textbook. So just to kind of clarify, there are certainly people in the time of the Enlightenment, a lot of the thinkers that we looked at, who are religious. So, you know, John Locke, for example, is notably Christian. But there's also some thinkers that start to become much more critical of the Roman Catholic Church and of the maybe abundance of reliance on religious authorities. So deists tend to be skeptical of organized religion. It is still believing in some type of higher authority, but believing that essentially, you know, a higher authority put people and things kind of in a space to do as they will. So there's, you know, an acceptance of both a divine power, but also inhuman reason. And deism becomes significant in the United States too, right? We see it in the American Enlightenment. So we had a bunch of questions in our conference, and I think, you know, it's useful to go back to these with some of the thinkers, because this really helps you see some of the ideas, and I'll try to comment on these, you know, for the various thinkers. We certainly can look at the way that the various thinkers consider freedom of speech and democracy, individual rights versus the rights of the collective or the rights of the group, role of religion in the political arena. And, you know, it's kind of interesting because we're having these same discussions today, right? These aren't really such foreign ideas. All of these are like kind of up for grabs in our current moment and certainly discussing them. And then, of course, the ideas of Montesquieu, the three branches of government, and this concept of representative government. So let's look specifically at some of the ideas. In particular, we looked at a lot of thinkers who focused on the realm of government, and the first is Thomas Hobbes. His work is Leviathan. We noted an excerpt from the DBQ packet from him this morning. This idea that, like, in the state of nature, people are essentially at war, people are driven by selfishness and greed, and you know, there is no order while people are at war. Everybody is insecure while people are at war. And Hobbes lived, of course, during the time of the English Civil War, and there isn't a sense that that's going to end well. So there really isn't a hopeful kind of situation, but yet, because people need security, people need government, and he does kind of create something that is maybe a step into Enlightenment thinking, which is the notion of a social contract. So people should agree essentially to sacrifice their individual liberty to a sovereign who can then make decisions on their behalf. And those decisions would include, like, to protect the society or defend the society against invaders or whatever it might be. And that without that, you know, people have much more to fear from their own neighbor than perhaps a sovereign, right? John Locke, who writes several decades later, more toward the period of the Glorious Revolution. This is after 1688, and there's been some resolution of sorts to how there's now a check on some of the monarch power in England. And, Locke talks about this idea of natural rights, that there are inalienable rights that everyone has. And these rights are the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to property. And that basically the purpose of government is that rulers have the responsibility to protect those rights. And so that's kind of why we would have rulers. And in Locke's version of things, there's also a social contract, but the social contract, kind of enables greater power to the people if the leaders do not kind of serve at the consent of the governed, then ultimately there can be some degree of a right to revolt. So the government has a duty to the people. It's embedded in the contract. The government breaks the contract, then the people can insist on a new government. Montesquieu, who is French, Hobbes and Locke are both English, in 1748 writes The Spirit of the Laws, and he's somebody who really focuses on the diffusion of powers and really considers the role of government as kind of multi sectioned. And he is somebody who studied the English system of government. And so he's following the English Parliament versus the English monarch, looking at the system of justice that exists in England and how the separation of powers is really crucial. So we kind of know a lot of Montesquieu's ideas because it's familiar to us from American history, but he comes to these conclusions in a way that at the time feels very radical because it is a slap in the face toward the divine right of kings and the notion of absolute power. And from where Montesquieu's coming from in France, those are, these are big ideas and kind of challenging ideas for him to espouse. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who writes in 1762, and he writes multiple things. He talked about education. He talked about kind of the notion of the family and the role of women, which he's not very favorable to an enlightenment for women. But in any case, his work on the social contract, he has a state of nature that basically man is good. What corrupts man and what makes man and humans, selfish and problematic. They're not like that in nature, but society's institutions and the way in which people have to compete with each other and jealousy and resentment and feelings like that essentially create very difficult situations for people. So, if people are corrupted and everybody is kind of in a space that's in a problematic way, Rousseau says we can kind of try to build in the state of nature into our society, not by putting everybody on an isolated island or having them be in a kind of perfect, situation alone by themselves. It's impossible to do that. Now we're in society, so we have to be kind of operating in society. But how can we create an environment where people look out for the common good rather than the individual? So rather than people, kind of creating a space for the protection of individual rights, a government's purpose is really to maintain, the common good. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. This idea of liberal thoughts, a really key emphasis comes from Locke, who is a physician at the time. But we also get the likes of somebody like Voltaire, who's a writer. He's a thinker and a writer, somebody who's arrested many times over in France for speaking out. He goes to England also to kind of speak about the English system as something that's like a step more enlightened than the French system. But this idea of natural rights, that's very much an Enlightenment ideal, that natural rights are inherent to all individuals in John Locke's notion of things, and then of course also like Thomas Jefferson's, because he just tweaks it. Pursuit of happiness and property are essentially the same thing. Life, liberty, and property, are kind of like the purpose of government is to protect that, and people have those rights. That's unalienable. Voltaire really does talk about the liberal idea of freedom of thought and expression. So, like something that Voltaire takes great issue with is types of censorship, whether that's through the government or that's coming from, peer pressure or the church, that degree of conformity where people can't speak their mind. That's something that Voltaire is speaking of. And we would call both of these ideas, liberal ideas. Okay. So these are like kind of fundamental rights of dignity. And, we even know in our modern Bill of Rights in the Constitution, quite a few of these types of freedoms of expression and whatnot are protected rights. Another idea that's kind of part of this Enlightenment liberalism is where there is a rule of law, so that a government exists where laws are applied consistently and equally to all. And, we would have to put in here to an extent. So we get like the Mary Wollstonecrafts and many others who are going to critique the Enlightenment for not really going beyond, property holding white men. And that is very much a, valid criticism of the Enlightenment. But we definitely do see like a kind of criticism of like unchecked absolute rulers who rule with themselves kind of at the helm without any fairness, for anyone else. So, we kind of are moving the liberal dial away from that type of rule. This also means limiting government, so limiting the scope and power of government. Checks and balances, you could put Montesquieu in there, the idea of representation, preventing abuse, protecting individual liberties, okay? This whole nature of the consent of the governed, keep that as something that's a really significant idea. This is the concept of the social contract, and social contract theory is big, but Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau all have versions of a social contract between the people and some form of government. It just exists in very different ways. In Locke's model, there are many, many different types of government, and basically political authority is in place because the people who are governed put it in place. And there is a voluntary aspect to the way government serves the common interest. And, again, if there is some sort of challenge that the government is not seeking that purpose, then people have the right to take down their government. Representative of government, this is kind of, another way to protect against the tyranny of one ruler. There would be elected representatives who would make decisions on behalf of the people. So, there is this mindset during the time of the Enlightenment that there is as much fear of the power of the people as there is, at least in John Locke's, space. He's not necessarily advocating for a direct democracy. He still believes that there needs to be officials and authorities in government who are making decisions. But this is kind of representation coming from the consent of the governed, right? So we kind of get representation as a concept. Thomas Hobbes, is an empiricist. It's something that makes him an Enlightenment thinker. He does have this state of nature where life is, basically very, very much filled with war. Early man was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and, life is short, okay? Absolute monarchy is basically sent by God to help mankind, but there is some degree of a social contract that people will willingly, in order to get security, push aside their own individual liberty to have a sovereign call the shot so that you don't have anarchy and chaos. So, Hobbes's government is like the best of all options in a certain time frame when anarchy essentially exists. And he also, sometimes his concepts, justify colonization, right? And this idea that, there is kind of a rightful monarch that's benevolent, and ultimately colonization comes into fray. We can certainly debate that. John Locke, who is a friend of Newton, he was a physician. He's very influential in America, both for writing slave codes as well as being influential in some documents like the Declaration of Independence. So a lot of the hypocrisy that we see in the American Declaration of Independence, like all men are created equal, sometimes, that kind of thing. We certainly see that in John Locke as well. His writing is most known as the Second Treatise of Civil